Jordan Peterson is the most famous psychologist since, like Dr. Phil. But while the general public is pretty clear on where they stand with Dr. Phil, Jordan Peterson has become a firebrand on the internet. The people who hate him are just as passionate as his loyal fan base. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at why he's so divisive and what the reasons for hating him are. Before we talk about the reasons to hate him though, we should look at why so many people love him. If you take a look at Peterson's backstory, it isn't anything very special. He wasn't born into a lot of privilege, but this isn't a rags to riches story either. But one thing is very clear throughout his education and his experience in academia. He's a very keen and accomplished psychologist. Long before he became famous on the internet, he became famous within the field of psychology, particularly in the study of personalities. He was a professor at Harvard, and he's published reams of research that has been cited hundreds of thousands of times. According to experts, Peterson is among the top 10 most cited authors in the field of personal psychology. So when he says things about people's mental health, he has the credentials to back him up. But that was a long time ago, and Peterson's rate of publishing has slowed down over the past decade. The majority of discourse around the man has less to do with his academic accomplishments and more to do with the fact that he's willing to lend his credibility to some unpopular viewpoints. The Jordan Peterson we know today stepped into the limelight in 2016. His home country of Canada was considering the controversial Bill C-16. It introduced many legislations that aim to prevent discrimination against people on the basis of their gender identity or expression. The bill was crafted to help the transgender community in Canada after a number of high-profile cases forced a national discussion on how they were treating this marginalized group. Peterson had a brief dalliance with politics in his teenage years, but like most researchers, his only interest in politics at the time was trying to secure grants for his work. But C-16 caught his attention, and not in a good way. In his opinion, being forced to respect the gender identity of trans people was an infringement on free speech, and he also expressed concerns that it was taking political correctness too far. He posted his views on social media and YouTube, and while he wasn't the only one sounding off on the issue, he certainly had the expertise to make the audience take notice. Sure, politics isn't his forte, but his arguments weren't restricted to politics. As he laid out in his viewpoint, he said that he felt that society was embracing too many leftist and politically correct ideas. He warned that doing this would spark an equal but opposite backlash from the right. He also swore that he would never respect the preferred pronouns of anyone, including his students and patients. The stuff he was saying brought him to the center of a culture war. This war climaxed in an encounter with a group of student activists at the University of Toronto, where he was working. But what those students learned is that Jordan Peterson isn't an easy man to beat in an argument, and that's part of what we'll be looking at today. A big reason why people don't like Jordan Peterson is his increasingly hateful opinions. Ironically, Jordan Peterson has become part of the very right-wing backlash he warned Canadians against in 2016. It became clear that Peterson's fan base has a type, and Peterson catered to them to build his brand. That has resulted in him having whatever the opposite of a Hall of Fame is, full of weird and provocative takes. Most recently, the man has lost access to his Twitter account. The reason why his Twitter account had to be taken away is a series of tweets where he heavily criticized Elliot Page for getting transition surgery. And it wasn't just Page who was subject to Peterson's ire. He called the doctor who performed the surgeries a criminal. But that's not all. Just this year, he declared that Russia invaded Ukraine because of American gender politics, and he fat-shamed Yumi Nu, who was the cover model of a recent issue of Sports Illustrated. He described the obligation to call the plus-sized Yumi Nu beautiful as an authoritative enforcement of body positivity. Opinions like these are never backed by the knowledge and experience that Peterson has, but the fact that he has them infers a legitimacy to these shot-from-the-hip takes. The truth is, the average person doesn't have the time or energy to fact-check every single thing, and Peterson's credentials are strong enough that if he says something, it could be assumed to be true. And it isn't just the LGBT community that has to worry about this. Peterson has repeatedly dismissed the entire political left wing as being communists and Marxists, and he's also cast doubt on climate change. He's against polarization in politics, but he's one of the most polarizing people on the internet today. That paradox is very frustrating to the people who are opposed to him. He also comes off as harsh and egotistical when he speaks or posts in public. This might just be the doctor side of Peterson coming out, but he's not one to mince his words. His combination of using academic language without the slightest bit of sugarcoating can lead him to come off as aggressive and combative. Some of that might be intentional, but some of it might not be. His way of presenting his ideas is consistent with his hatred of political political correctness. One of the things that's destroying society, according to Peterson, is the fact that we can't have honest conversations anymore. Everything we say has to be worded in a certain way to avoid offending anyone, and that prevents us from being able to address things in the way they need to be addressed. You might be able to agree on some level with what Peterson is saying there, but some of his most extreme fans take his stance against political correctness the wrong way. Whatever Peterson thinks of the LGBT community, he doesn't seem like he'd approve of using slurs against them or against other minorities, yet there's plenty of hate being slung on the internet, and his name is attached to it. Speaking of fans, the credibility that Jordan Peterson wields also makes it difficult to argue with his fans. The average person is unlikely to get face-to-face with Peterson, but his fans make up a sizable group of netizens. Anyone who frequents comment sections will have encountered at least one Jordan Peterson fan, and they can be tough to argue against. After all, Jordan Peterson is a strong reference for any argument that has to do with psychology and the way personalities work. In this sense, he's become the standard bearer for the so-called anti-SJW movement on the internet. Most internet social justice warriors aren't as academically accomplished as Peterson is, nor do they have a default reference to back up their arguments. On the other hand, the anti-SJW segment can interpret Peterson's statements in any way they like. Best case scenario, the argument shifts from social justice to interpreting Peterson. Worst case scenario, as long as the opponents of social justice can lean on Peterson's statements, they'll never be convinced that they're wrong. So now that we've looked into the reasons that people hate Jordan Peterson, the only question left is whether hating him is the right thing to do. It's possible for a person to be wrong about some things and right about other things. That's a fact that both sides of the Peterson divide have to understand. Jordan Peterson is very knowledgeable about certain topics, but that doesn't give him carte blanche to declare anything he believes to be fact. At the same time, we shouldn't dismiss everything he says out of hand. In his studies in psychology, Peterson would have studied the work of Sigmund Freud in detail. Freud was an instrumental figure in the field of psychology, and our understanding of how the human mind works wouldn't be the same without him. But he also presented the Oedipus and Electra complexes as serious psychological theories. So you see, Freud was right about a lot of things and very, very wrong about others. One of the things that Peterson is right about is that it has gotten really hard to have conversations with strangers, but it's not because of political correctness. People have gotten this tendency to cling on to their beliefs way too strongly, and once someone is convinced of something, they never want to hear that they might be wrong. This applies to people who are politically left, but it also applies to the politically right, and many of those are Peterson's fans. What the world needs is to open their minds to differing points of view. We can only hope that someday, a guy with multiple PhDs and thousands of published papers will come along and advocate for moderation and understanding in internet discourse. That's it for today's video. What do you think of Jordan Peterson? Whether you're a fan or a hater, we'd like to know what you think about the stuff we talked about today. As much as Jordan Peterson is a recipe for a chaotic comment section, we're all for frank discourse. But don't check out without liking, sharing, and subscribing.